Gerry, welcome to Pull Up a Chair. I'm absolutely delighted to have you today because you've got such an impressive career across financial services, latterly as chairman of Barclays Bank, Standard Life Aberdeen, City UK, and now GemCorp Capital Management. But also you've got that beautiful mix of government experience, having spent 20 years at the MOD and as the first Minister for Investment in 2020 till 2022. So today we're going to sort of explore that mixture of government, business and politics. But before I do that, I would like to start with the first question, which is, what does sustainable growth mean to you?
Well, first of all, Bina, thank you very much for having me here today. Very pleased to be in your hot seat. Now, sustainability growth, I think one of the challenges is it's become a bit of a hackneyed phrase. People throw it out without always really thinking about it. When I think about it, I think it very much down sort of three axes: the economic axes, the environmental axes, and the social axes. Financial axes, I mean, easy. If you overreach yourself, if countries overreach themselves, if businesses overreach themselves, it's very hard to get back onto a steady path again. Environmental, so important. I mean, sort of self-evident. I went to watch Kyoto, this play in the West End, which is about COP3. And it's in some ways it's remarkable that we've made progress since then, but also it's remarkable how little progress we've made since then. And last but certainly not least, the social aspects, inclusion, equality of opportunity. As someone who's benefited very much from equality of opportunity during my life, I'm passionate about that. I'm passionate about education. And I think all of us have a role to play in that.
Yeah, and it's actually really lovely because we talk about, how do you grow to meet the needs of people, planet and profit, which are effectively your three axes in a slightly different way. There is a lot of turbulence that businesses are facing into, whether it's growth, whether it's delivering to those three axes. And we're going to talk a lot about the opportunities. But what do you think are the biggest challenges right now?
Well, look, there's so many out there. I mean, I think the world has become a very uncertain place. Business is so much more complicated when I was young. I mean, basically, when I was young, it was about making profits and paying dividends. And boards didn't give much attention to things other than that. So much more complicated. So we have the geopolitical, challenges nowadays. Yep. We've already mentioned climate. We have those challenges today, and we have conflicts. The world is deep in conflicts again. I'm of the post-Second World War generation who thought we were going to have peace, we were going to have multilateralism, and sadly, all this is beginning to break down.
You're a very strong advocate and very vocal in the importance of trade and investment globally. I'd just like for our audience, for you just to articulate why you feel it's so important.
Trade and investment is the route to economic growth, and economic growth is the route to sustainability, the things that we've been talking about, and it's economic growth that gives opportunity towards people. I was amazed when I was investment minister to discover that foreign invested businesses in the UK are 70% more productive than their domestic counterparts. They export more, they generate more IP. They tend to make better use of capital. They have good industrial relationships, and that was a kind of a frightening statistic. So if you can bring in foreign investment, it lifts the whole environment. But of course, it's a globally competitive sport. Yeah. Everybody wants foreign investment, and you've got to be very careful in order to achieve it, being very specific about what your propositions are and what your advantages are.
Can't move on to the UK until I've sort of explored geopolitics.
Okay.
With a new administration in the US, how do you see that impacting the sort of trade and investment landscape, and also, I guess, how it might impact the UK?
Well, look, the era of the second Trump presidency is revolutionary, isn't it? He's only been in office a short time now, but look at what's happened. He glories in unpredictability. He glories in making people feel unsettled. And it is the breakdown of things that we've taken for granted over the last, 50, 60, 70 years. So I think it's very hard to predict the exact consequences of it, other than knowing it is going to be extraordinarily disruptive. And Make America Great Again is not just a slogan; it's a way of life.
Yeah.
For Trump and his followers, and that's going to have an extraordinary impact all around the world.
And it does, and especially when we're in a place where growth is very important for economies as much as it is for business. Growth because we need to invest into the things you talked about. So for the UK, that presents other opportunities potentially. How do you see the importance of the UK-European relationship as we face into this new world and new global landscape?
Well, look, I was a passionate advocate for us remaining in Europe. I was never in favour of any kind of political union, But if you were running a major business, to lose the opportunities of accessing that market on equal terms, purely in kind of practical measures, was a huge mistake. And sadly, since that has happened, I think the UK has become diminished globally. You look back, 10 years ago when we had, very strong position in Europe, very strong relationships with the US, very strong relationships with China. A lot's changed since then. So the UK, I'm afraid, doesn't have the position that it did before. And that affects trade, it affects investment, it affects our influence around the world. These are very, very different times that we're living in.
So, Gerry, you've had such a broad experience, not just in the sectors, but even the geographies. You've got a very influential role and have lived and worked here across the ASPAC region, the Middle East and Europe, as well as the Americas. And you've led some really important initiatives to improve the competitiveness of the UK in the global landscape. How have those experiences that you've had shaped your perspective, and how does that really help the UK be on a footing for sustainable growth?
Well, I'm one of those old-fashioned people who would call themselves a globalist. I think I counted up once, and I think I've earned money and worked in something like 63 countries.
Wow.
Around the world. It leaves you with the overwhelming impression about the need for equality of opportunity. I'm a passionate believer that people are all the same, just some people have more advantages than others. So for the UK to make its way in that, in the world that we have now, we have to be very specific about what are we offering people? What is the UK offer? What are our selling propositions?
So again, just following on from that, from your experience, how do you think the UK is, you talked about it being a global sport, attracting investment. How do you think the UK is progressing in that global environment?
Well, I'm afraid I don't think we're doing as well as we should do. I think that we went through a period of huge stability and unpredictability. Part of my role was to try to settle things down, and I think we began to make some progress about that. But I'm afraid that we become a little bit unpredictable again. I mean, completely understandable. Any new government which comes in, rightly and properly, wants to do its own thing. It's why we have changes of government, to allow governments to do their own thing. But it does mean that business then has to recalibrate itself to the new policies. Investors have to recalibrate themselves to the new policies. But we do now badly require to be very, very specific about what is the UK offer going forward. And it's desperately important that the government succeeds in doing that, because investment is so important to everybody in the UK. I think we are the most heavily foreign invested of any developed country. So for the UK, investment is not just nice to have, it's absolutely sort of critical to have for the UK.
In your role as Minister for Investment, you would have dealt with global investors, and you've also worked with other governments across the world. Is there anything we can learn from those that seem to be doing it really well today?
I think the ones who are doing it really well have a sense of direction, and they lay down that sense of direction, and they stick to it. When I used to be negotiating with global investors on behalf of the UK, and negotiating with global multinationals, they're very, very specific in what they want, and they're very demanding in what they want. So I used to always argue, attracting investment, it's 80% process. Do you have the right opportunities? Are you handling the regulation and all these things well? But it is 20% flair, and there's a lot of personality in it. Surprisingly, this isn't just about kind of cash flows. If you can make investors feel that they're welcome, there's no doubt at the margin it encourages them to come here. But there are, of course, very different classes of investors. You have financial investors, you have people who want to invest in projects, you have multinationals who are choosing where to site factories or where to site assembly lines, and you have small businesses and entrepreneurs who are working out where to develop their business, where is the best climate, where is the best atmosphere for them. And each of those have very specific requirements. So you have to be very well aware of segmentation, how to attract each of them. And you have to work very, very hard at it. On a good day, I would have, 15, 16, 17 meetings. I would see some days, 100, 150 investors in a day. And you just have to keep on doing that.
We certainly saw flair at the very first investment summit that you hosted and organised, and it was obvious to me that people were feeling welcomed and that Britain was open. The most recent investment summit attracted something like 63 billion, creating 38,000 jobs. So I think there is something about the flair because it does attract interest. As we look forward, as you see the world has evolved, and you talked about the different types of investment, all needing specific opportunities. The reality is we have to prioritise. What would your advice be in terms of the things to really focus on as we face into the current uncertainty, the current environment?
It was really brilliant at this last investment summit just a few months ago. On the final evening reception, they had both King Charles there and Elton John.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to create an environment where people go away and they say to themselves, boy, that was something. So that's an example of flair. But the other thing, you have to do that to make people think of you. But also you have to create the opportunities. When I was negotiating with my friend Chandra of Tata about where to site the gigafactory he wanted to build in the UK, to build batteries for JLR and for others. They reckoned there were only 2 possible sites in the UK, possible being the right geographical area and the right access to electricity.
Yep.
So imagine that, they only had 2 choices. So we have to do much more work in preparing the opportunities. People can't invest in an aspiration. When I first came into my role, I found that Whitehall was littered with what I call investment aspirations. People would mouth the words gigafactory, green hydrogen, AI, fintech. And then when you look for what were the specific opportunities, the file was empty. There was nothing behind it. Well, a lesson I tried to drill into people was that investors can't invest in a thought. They can't invest in an aspiration. They're investing in something.
Yeah.
And that has a place, and it requires things to make it work. So we have to get much better at putting those kind of bits and pieces in place that you need for things to happen.
Gerry, you talked about preparing the UK for opportunities, not just being aspirational. And to do that, you need to be practical in terms of what you're actually offering. What advice would you give the UK government as we, lead into the growth agenda in terms of practical?
It's such an important question, that, Bina. I think that they have to be well organised. They have to have a very clear purpose, and they have to have very clear lines of communications with investors. it may sound simple, but the C-suite love to know who to pick up a phone to just to get things done. Almost like a help desk.
Yeah.
And they really have to have, it has to be very clear who they have to talk to. And again, it sounds a simple thing, but governments sometimes forget to do that. So governments need to be well organized. They need to be practical in what they say and what they do. They have to have substance. There's no point in just blathering on about growth unless it's sort of rooted in something. And coming back to our constant theme, it has to be practical, it has to be useful, or frankly, why would investors, why would CEOs waste their time here if they can go and do it somewhere else?
One of the things that we used to talk about was how do you make it easy for an investor? Part of it is obviously things like, have you prepared, I like that phrase, preparing the opportunity. Have we got the ingredients in the right place to allow the investment to come in? But it was also how you welcome the investment in and making sure that it was all joined up across central government to local. And coming on to local, majority of investment does come into the southeast and London, and it has done. And part of the modern industrial strategy is to really attract investment into the regions, part of which is what you're talking about, making sure the ingredients are there. What else do we need to do to make our regions as attractive as the southeast and London?
Well, again, it comes back to working out what is the proposition. I am a passionate advocate of manufacturing and of manufacturing investment. There's huge skills, and it was manufacturing which often created the whole kind of fabric in some of our great sort of towns and cities, because manufacturing would bring in above average wages, it would bring in apprenticeships, and it would almost bring in sort of social hierarchies and a way of living in places. And when we took all that away, or when it all sort of fell away, we didn't do enough to replace it. Sometimes I feel guilty about the fact that in the 1980s I was in charge of privatisation, working for Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson, and I think I ran 26 of the big privatisations then, which was a tremendous success economically, socially, politically. But the sadness was that we didn't replace the holes that we left in our regions with anything else. We should have done much more at that time to create the skills, to create the new opportunities, to encourage companies to come and invest there. So again, it's just an example of the fact that you can use words. One can use words like industrial strategy. One can use the now out of fashion phrase levelling up, but you have to reduce it down to the practicalities. Both when I was, the chair of global Fortune 500 companies, and when I was a minister, I've got no real time for just talking about these things. You've always got to say to yourself, what practical outcome can you achieve from it?
Yeah.
And that is so important if one is to get things done.
Yeah, that's the one thing I can vouch for, Gerry, that you are actually, so what are we going to do about it? Let's not just talk about it, absolutely, in one conversation. So something you just touched on there, so manufacturing, services is very important to the UK. Technology is very important, and we're now beginning to see great clusters of technology and technology hubs around the UK. So you see this beautiful moulding of the manufacturing skills, the tech skills and services, and organisations like ours, are spread across the UK for that reason too. But education is really important, right? And education and preparing our workforce for the future. You have often talked about and been very complimentary around the Gulf and how they're approaching education and preparing their workforce. Anything that we could share for our listeners there?
Well, again, it comes back to a theme, Bina, that you and I have been discussing. It's getting things done. And for example, you look at Saudi Arabia, the ruling family identified, 10, 15 years ago, that the young were becoming radicalized, and that this was going to, challenge the whole foundations of the state eventually. So what did they do? They embarked on this program of education, of bringing in opportunities, indeed westernization there. And this wasn't just some moral drive. It was a practical drive to take the kingdom into a new era. Now, look, these things take time, but it comes back again to the point we keep on talking about, is the need for long-term planning, the need to work out what your goals are, how you're going to achieve them. And I have been in the last, 30, 40 years, so many discussions about skills, how to increase the skills in the UK. I mean, do you remember these meetings that you and I have been to year in, year out, talking about the skills agenda, talking about how important this is? And the sad fact is we've achieved far too little on that. It's an interesting question. Why have we been so bad at that? What's gone wrong that we aren't able to get young people into the right jobs? We aren't able to get people motivated to do things. And again, it's a really important job for this government, any government, to get on with.
Yeah, and I would say that I think business has a big role as well. As the needs and skills are evolving quite fast, it's quite hard for a government to react to that. So I think business is also now beginning to lean in and help and making sure that it's able to equip the next generation. And I keep calling it Gen Z, but you know what I mean. It's the younger generation coming into the workforce, because they work differently, they want different things.
Yes.
They're hungry for knowledge.
Yes.
So how do you equip them with something, and then they sort of fill their rucksack and move on to the next one? But the whole essence of sustainable growth is for the long term.
Yes.
But as a business, and you would have, you've sat at the helm of many businesses, that challenge of the short term, whether it's profits, dividends, or whether it's whatever it is, whether your shareholder expectations, and delivering for the long term is a big challenge. And you've said as well that climate change is the biggest opportunity since the Industrial Revolution, which is really exciting because it's an opportunity. The challenge is, how do you actually get it done when you're trying to manage long-term planning, yet still delivering for a short to medium term?
Yes. It's complicated.
It is complicated.
No, it's difficult, but we should never forget that every investment, nearly every investment, it has a place, and then you need to create the ecosystem around the place. And what is that ecosystem? It is universities. It is schools. It is training. It is financial and professional services. It's all these things which go to create vibrant local communities. And it's very important to identify, both in business and in government, what do you need to achieve things? What ecosystem do you need to create in order to achieve your objectives?
I like that ecosystem, because we talk about collaboration and working, but it is about creating an ecosystem to enable success in a, whether it's a place or a sector or whether it's an industry. I'm going to pivot to leadership, if that's okay. How you would describe impactful leadership, and how you feel that may have evolved or is evolving as we sort of move into this sort of newer world.
Yes. Well, look, first of all, I think leaders must have a real sense of purpose, and they must imbue the people that they are leading with that sense of purpose. And they have to have drive, they have to have determination. But of course, being a chairman, and most of my life is spent being an intermediary, I sometimes wonder what it would have been like to have been a CEO, when you can tell people what to do and they do it, generally speaking. Because if you're a chairman, you're always having to nudge the system. You're having to put things into alignment. You'll have to get people to do things without them necessarily realizing that you're getting them to do it. So it's a different form of leadership. And I always like to think of my CEOs with their heads down, going for their objectives, going for their performance, working out how to motivate the workforce, just kind of getting on with things. Whereas the chairman has the luxury of more time, and he or she can look to the left or right, can see what the environment is, can think about sustainability, to bring it onto the board agenda. And the most successful companies, in my experience, are those which get both the leadership that the chairman gives to the board and the leadership that the CEO gives to the company properly balanced. It's a very subtle, complex relationship, and I don't think enough attention is paid to helping chairmen understand that. Helping chairmen realize what is this kind of interaction, how do you get it right, and a good chairman has to be incredibly kind of situationally aware. He or she has to be incredibly kind of aware of the dynamics, has to have very high EQs. So leadership takes many forms, but at the end it's a sense of purpose, making people feel valued, making people feel that their job is worthwhile, and creating that two-way bond between the managers and the workforce. And that requires trust, it requires loyalty, it requires communication, etc., etc. It's not rocket science, but boy, it's surprising how few people, in my experience, are really good at it.
That's really interesting. So if you were to sort of bring that down to the top 3 skills.
Well, look, first of all, people do need to be competent. Now that may seem a very simple thing to say, but I guess that you and I, in our working lives, even with some very senior people, you leave the meeting at the end of the day, or you think, well, that person isn't up to much in terms of what they do. So you have to have competence. You have to have drive and energy. And again, that seems an obvious point, but people who work harder, do better than people, generally speaking, who don't work so hard. People do need vision. It's very hard to take people somewhere unless you know where it is that you want to take them to. And that goes, across all sorts of organizations.
As you reflect on your career, what's the bit of advice that you would give to your younger self, or give to people currently running businesses?
My issue is I've never had a work-life balance. I've always had a work-work balance, which isn't the most kind of healthy ways of living. And sometimes you can get, just kind of get carried away by the drive. So if I had my time again, I think I'd be more reflective. I would try and be nicer to people, I think. But I wouldn't want to lose any of my energy, my drive, because in the end, it's those factors that make all of us, don't they?
Well, your energy and drive is what's led the organisations that you've worked with get to where they are and what we're achieving here in the UK. So thank you for your energy and drive. Given that you've just talked about work-work balance, and you have drive and energy, and you get things done, and by God, do you get things done, how do you sustain yourself?
Oh, well, I do like sleeping when I get the opportunity to sleep. I think that is very, very important.
Yeah.
And I'm a great believer in the back of a car, or if you're going somewhere, falling asleep. No, but also more seriously, you have to sustain yourself by being, constantly consciousness of the richness of life, the richness of one's family, the richness of different cultures, the richness of the world, and really try to, infect all that you do with some beliefs and some structure.
Wonderful. Gerry, thank you so much. I don't even know where to start with summing up, but what I will do is I do like your 3 axes: economic, environmental, and social, because they do resonate with what we talk about: people, planet, profit. But the way you articulated them is, around not overreaching. I think it is really important to remember not to overreach. We are ambitious, and it's okay to have ambition, but not overreach. To have pace, being maintaining the pace, and also it comes through in everything you've done. And we've talked about skills, you know, really doing the right thing for people to thrive in whatever they do. You talked about preparing for opportunities, being really clear in the direction, making sure we've created the environment and put the ingredients in place that people can then put it all together to make it successful. And that ecosystem, the sense of ecosystem, it all comes back to purpose and vision, which you've just talked about in terms of leadership skills. So much in there. So thank you very, very much, Gerry, for joining me today.
I've really enjoyed it, Bina. I mean, it's made me think about a lot of things. I've never been on desert island discs, but it's felt remarkably like that today. I just wished you'd asked me to choose my 6 favourite records as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.